one of my roles is I do a lot of work in the NHS, but I also do a lot of work in public health related activities here in the UK. And then I'm heavily involved in the diaspora movement. So being a child of the Windrush generation, my father came from Jamaica, my mother from Montserrat. I was born here in London. And but I've worked extensively in the Caribbean and a couple of 2 or 3 countries in Africa. And what I noticed in particular, so what I'm going to focus on would be around NHS blood and transplant, NHS BT. So I've done a lot of work around health promotion and public awareness when it comes to prostate health, cancer, diabetes, etc. But taking it as an example, NHS BT, there's an extensive program running all the time around blood donation. So across the country, the general population, it's still only around about 3% of the population actually donate blood. But when you break it down into the different ethnic groups within across the country, when it comes to African and Caribbean population groups, as an example, it's about 1%. And even though we still have a high degree of sickle cell sufferers, there's not a lot of understanding in the community as it relates to blood donation coming from the same ethnic group that is better for people. So I've been working on this campaign with NHSBT for the last 10 years. And so what I said about 5 or 6 years ago now, I said that what we needed to do is think about the wider diaspora movement in the Caribbean, meaning the friends and families of the people here in the UK, and also to use and start to think about who are the most influential members of the community as well. So for example, would be high commissioners. So when I met Francis, it made me think of, originally we facilitated a lot of medical equipment to the Caribbean health system. So if you remember those 40-foot mobile blood units that used to be around in car parks and supermarket car parks, I facilitated 4 of those into the Caribbean health system: Antigua and Barbuda, Jamaica, St. Lucia, and Grenada. And then in order to thank the NHS here with those communities here, we set up a program with the high commissioners and other key influential people here to say, well, look, from the NHS, this donation has been made to contribute to the health system within the Caribbean. And almost not exactly, we'd like you to be part of the blood donation campaigns and raise awareness. And that went down very well. And that system worked very well. We got the high commissioners on board. We got the different cultural groups on board. And that kind of continues today. So when I spoke to Francis then, I kind of made the point that you can almost apply that way of thinking for climate change. And that's when first we thought about health climate action. So how do we link the climate action awareness of a population group, like say the Caribbean population groups, and why would they be interested in climate change here? And they're interested in it because there's been a lot of floods in the Caribbean, volcano eruptions over the last 20 years. Every year, at least one of the English-speaking Caribbean islands, there'll either be a flood, hurricane, storm, or volcano eruption. And the community here mobilize in order to support their friends and family. So the but they don't relate that necessarily to climate change as such. They just relate it to a disaster, so which they're responding to. So if we think of how that can translate here now, from a communication perspective, informing the communities here and making that link back to the Caribbean that is about climate change, that to me, and we've started to think about that, and we've run a couple of online forums to make people aware to make that link in a way that they hadn't made it before, because they don't really think of it as being climate change. They just know there's a flood or there's a hurricane or there's a storm, and they're responding to. And of course, and given that these are our local communities, they are in their neighborhoods. And then at the same time now, we've been able to introduce the thinking around air pollution, in particular, living on the neighborhood estates, lack of green spaces. And so we've kind of used this now as being a way as an education program in terms of raising awareness. There's lots of awareness around climate change, but it's understanding, public understanding, community understanding. And that's what we've been able to do as it relates to the introduction to this topic by Francis. So the way I'm explaining it, you can see that there's a balance that you're making all the time between what's going on here, what's going on in the Caribbean, and how it affects their way of thinking and acting, and trying to work out, well, what is going on, but most importantly, what role can they play? And they can now start to see, well, climate change, it is about climate change, and it means something. It's not just a storm, it's not just a flood over there in the Caribbean. So, but there's still some work to be done, because even this way of thinking that we're talking about now is not widespread in terms of the way we're speaking about it. It's really started to in the last few months, particularly when Francis and myself first spoke about it. So there's not a concrete program of activities, in other words, to go with it at the moment.